Okay, everyone. Thanks again, of course, for coming out. This is about conflict resolution. And I think that this is completely important for a number of reasons I'm going to get into. Like what? Well, first, if you Google conflict resolution, you're going to get 1,000 different, pieces of information. The same with what I'm going to go over really quick. Track one and track two policies. Track one of diplomacy basically deals with state actors, powerful actors, etc. Track two is more NGOs, private business, etc. Both have strengths and weaknesses, which are pretty obvious, right? On the one hand, these kinds of states have interests. So is the United States a good diplomatic player in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Obviously, the United States has a bias. The same thing goes with, say, NGOs. NGOs are supposed to be, that is, non-governmental organizations. They're supposed to be neutral. They often aren't, and they don't have a lot of power, do they? But it's still, good to understand those levels. Now, we have different types of organizations as well involved. One, we have state organizations, right? The United Nations, made up of states. The OAS, Organization of American States in Latin America. And we have diplomatic corps, Russia, Norway, the United States, etc. Those can be good because they have power, but they also can be problematic if there's a big power structure within them. We also have other organizations like NGOs, which are supposed to be neutral. Sometimes they are. A good example is when Jimmy Carter, who has a group that goes around analyzing elections all over the world. He went to Nicaragua, and when the Sandinistas were voted out, which the United States liked, he had a seal of approval of that election, and everyone was like, "Oh, that's great! Jimmy Carter's great." But then when he went to Venezuela, he said, "I'm going to be objective." And when he certified the elections in Venezuela, when we didn't like the government under Hugo Chavez, everyone was like, Jimmy Carter has peanuts for brains. He was from Georgia and he lived on a peanut farm, right? He had a peanut farm. This guy's crazy. And then a lot of misinformation about the elections, et cetera, spread. Point is, Jimmy Carter's group, monitoring elections in developing countries, was very good at being objective. The United States, Russia, and China, let's face it, a lot less so. But the reality is we kind of need big state actors because they play a major role. So how can they reach conflict resolution? One of the things you'll be watching is on the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a very important video. The reason why, it goes without saying, we almost came to nuclear war. And it goes over kind of, what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about. I was not alive back then. Sleepy Joe was, and so was Trump, and they're still around. So, but what's interesting about it, in the end, they talk about how each major player needed a way out of this conflict to save face. So Kennedy got the missiles out of Cuba, but Khrushchev also could go back to the hardliners in the Soviet Union and say, we got missiles out of Turkey. They achieved something. Each side has to achieve something. Why is that important? Well, in the Ukrainian crisis, we have to figure something out. And other bigger crises, right, that we don't really hear about, like we're going to see a video on Ethiopia and Eritrea. This is problematic with also rebel groups involved. So we have to give our enemies something. We don't like it, but we have to. That is, you saw the movie on El Salvador. They gave the FMLA something. They incorporated them into the system, which is going to be next week. So you have to give your enemy something, even if you level them. So if you look at Japan, we dropped big bombs on them. We can debate whether we should have or shouldn't have not done that. But, we helped build them up, wrote the Constitution, brought them back into the international system. So you have to basically, deal with your opponent sooner or later when you're dealing with these big state actors. There's other ways too for conflict resolution. One is behind me. This is the Center of Memory and Reconciliation in Colombia. The government of Colombia, under a conservative government, actually did something very interesting. And I authored an article on this you'll be taking a look at, is through what I call South-South relations. What the former president of Colombia did was he made relations with Cuba, a communist country, in order to go into a, well, I would say it was, unfortunately, it was voted against by the Colombian people because they had some problems with it, but then it was readjusted, changed some things, and then it passed through the Congress. But it was basically a peace initiative to end the longest civil war in Colombia. And I took this picture, I visited, it's kind of in a sketchy area, not the prettiest memorial. But it is interesting because by using Cuba opposed to the United States, right? It opens space for conflict resolution strategies that otherwise wouldn't be considered. And that helped Colombia end the Civil War. Number one, Cuba gave the FARC, that was the guerrilla group, which some trained in, a gust of credibility, right? Because Cuba's on board with it. Second, it removed the soldiers of the FARC, that was the guerrilla group trying to overthrow the Colombian government, from the country. So during the peace process, they couldn't attack. During an earlier peace process, they gave them land like the size of Sweden, and they just started keeping on attacking people. So they kind of rejuvenated the FARC, and that was a big mistake. And Santos, the president, said Cuba, they can go to Cuba and hammer out the deal. That way you're removing them from the country and they can't do any harm here. Moreover, by being in Cuba, you can actually create safety for these guerrilleros. So they're not being attacked by people that absolutely hate them, and many in Colombia do. So they could hammer out a lot of these deals, from land reform becoming a real party, etc. And it also helped give credibility to the hardliners who were against the peace process, who actually went to Cuba in order to participate in this process. It was a very, very smart process, but this was what we call South-South relations. Instead of dealing with a pawnbroker, right, or a peace broker that is obviously biased, like the United States, Russia, China, etc., that have a big stake in the international system. It went to Cuba, and Cuba gave this some, not just credibility, but it also played kind of an objective role in this. So it was very, very good strategy by the former defense minister, who was very conservative, Santos, who basically, helped gain peace. Now, a lot of people don't like Santos. There's a lot of criticism of the peace process, etc., getting the Nobel Prize. That's all fine to criticize, but it still did end the civil war in Colombia, the longest civil war. Although I don't like the word civil war because there's so many foreign powers involved. But regardless, that's another way, right, to help create peace. But what's interesting about that is that then the United Nations stepped in. So you see not only governments, but then you see an international organization involved. And the United Nations was the only one capable of collecting all the weapons of the FARC, because they have a lot of weapons. You don't want them to go back killing people. So they started collecting all these weapons. Very interesting what the United Nations did. And then the United Nations and then other NGOs, now we're seeing a multi-track diplomacy, more NGOs came in to help give the FARC education, among other things. And as you'll see in a video that I show in a lot of my classes, how they were trying to incorporate the FARC. Those are the former guerrilleros, that's the name of the group that was trying to overthrow the government, into society. So this is a very, very important initiative in how we can create conflict resolution strategies. It's very difficult. You're going to see a video on Eritrea and Ethiopia and another group in area Tigres, how they were able to come to conflict resolution and to arrive to some kind of deal. And notice in that video that they use actually the Nigerian president, as a I always say pawnbroker, but as to help uh create peace. These regional initiatives, UNASUR, that used to be around but we closed, and other regional initiatives, ASEAN, etc., can play important roles within conflict resolution. The problem is, let's face it, most conflict resolution fails until someone is sooner or later wiped out. Sometimes if there's such a stalemate, like to a certain degree in Russia and the Ukraine, although Russia is gaining ground, there will be also a peace process. But peace is very elusive concept. It's very difficult to get. Um, I, would like to be able to, like a lot of these academics and policymakers love to, if you Google something, oh yeah, these are the steps of peace, track one, track two, multi-stage, all these things. It's a very difficult situation. In fact, a lot, and I know this is going to sound like, violence is an answer when we're supposed to say violence isn't. But when you look at what happened in El Salvador, if the FMLN, the guerrilla group, wasn't about to attack the capital city, San Salvador, and take it over, they probably wouldn't have gone into negotiations. Sometimes you do have to show, I know it's not the way the world is supposed to be, but sometimes it's the way the world is, your enemy that you can harm, you know, the other side. Basically, you have to show your enemy, I can destroy you. I can do horrible things to you. You have to come to the negotiation table. And that happens a lot. And if you've taken my empirical inquiry or other classes, I show the hunting ground where women finally stood up and said, we're not going to take this anymore. And they went out and protested against how these liberal universities were covering up years of sexual harassment and sexual assault. The same thing you saw in the Boston video where the Black population finally grew tired of the white population stealing money from it. And it said, look it, we're not going to take it anymore. That attitude is very useful. You see Black Lives Matter. I don't know what everyone thinks about all these different groups, but they basically were like, we're tired of being attacked by the police. We're going to do something about it. That's when you start getting reform. So going out and joining a social movement is very, very important. I'm not telling you to go out and join a guerrilla movement. We don't want that. Like the Underground Weathermen and all these groups of the 1960s, or Antifa now, or what happened in January 6th, etc. You're going to see a video. The question is, how do you get to peace? And when you watch a short video from Trump Plaza, because I'm good friends with Trump, you're going to ask yourself, would those people, right, have stopped if they weren't arrested? What would have they done if they actually? And that's a question I want you to answer. What would have the rioters, insurrectionists, people who were involved in a coup d'etat, or just bunch of guys and women having a good time? I don't know how you interpret January 6th against the U.S. government. Would have they hung Mike Pence? That's a good question. So you want to watch that, and it brings up a lot of issues with not only why people go out and commit that collective violence, but how do we arrive to some conclusion of how do we arrive to these conflict resolution deals, because that's what they are, and how spoilers can ruin them, and how we can get rid of them, and how we basically can facilitate conflict resolution. I wish I had great answers. I've read peer reviews and policymakers, and oh man, I have the answers. No, you don't. If you had the answers, there'd be very little conflict. I don't think we do. Look at what's going on in Myanmar, the Sudan, and that's another problem with conflict. When bigger conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Ukraine, and Russia, then it overshadows and eclipses. Ooh, and we just had an eclipse. I like that pun. Well, I don't like the conflict, but it eclipses because I just saw the eclipse. The smaller issues, like what's going on in Haiti now, is absolutely disastrous. So, how can we come to conflict resolution places that are so intractable like Haiti? And I'm just going to stop there. And I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers, although I have most. And let you kind of maybe do a paper or something and figure out how can we create more conflict resolution or facilitate conflict resolution processes throughout the world. And I want to thank you for listening, even though I don't have many answers. Take care, everyone.